I just started that for the, so we can put this on YouTube later.
Okay.
Okay.
And whenever you are ready, just say the word and we'll start broadcasting.
All right. We'll wait a few
more minutes.
A few seconds, and then we'll get started. It takes people 1 minute somehow for everyone to be logged in. So time for me to announce the events next week, and yeah. All is good?
Yeah. Sorry.
All is good?
Oh, if everything's good. Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Good.
Yeah. it has to, right? Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think we can go.
Okay.
Yeah. You broadcast us, Jared?
Yep,
Yeah.
you are live.
All right. Wonderful.
Awesome.
So let's wait a minute for everyone to join us for this meeting, and then I'll introduce the events this week, and as well as introduce you. All right, I think we can get started. I want to welcome you to today's lunchtime talk. Before introducing our speaker, I wanted to remind you of the events this week. On Friday, Diane O'Leary, a center fellow, will be giving a lecture on making philosophical sense of medicine's position on mind and body at noon. On Monday next week at 1:30, we have two talks in the Problem of Cognitive Ontology seminar series that happens on Monday and Thursdays. The two talks are going to be given by Vincent Bergeron as well as Javier Gomez-Lavin. And on Tuesday next week at noon, we have a lunchtime talk given by Center Fellow Ed Slovic and entitled A Note on Kant as Precursor of Mak, for considering Kant's metaphysical foundations of natural science from a Hegelian frame. Ed is challenging me with all these proper names. So also before introducing our speaker today, let me remind you that we're using a Zoom webinar and not Zoom meeting. Most of you are attendees at this point, where we are panelists. If you have a question during the Q&A period after around 1, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A button. And then you just write your name there. And during the Q&A, I will promote you to the status of panelist, and you can ask your questions directly to Mak instead of me having to translate or to repeat your question to Mak. So just click on the Q&A button and write your name, and then you'll be able to ask him your question directly. So today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mak Pedroso, who is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Towson University in Maryland. I hope I'm not butchering the name, Towson.
No, that's good. That's really good.
All right, great. And we're delighted that he's a Center Fellow this semester at the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. He completed his PhD with Mark Ereshevsky at the University of Calgary. He's published extremely widely in the best journals in philosophy of science. He focuses mostly in the philosophy of biology, but he's got paper in the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, Biology and Philosophy, Biological Theory, and as well as in scientific journals, including the famous and important proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's published extremely widely on cooperation, conflict, biological individuals, ancestry and biological classification, and so on. And we're really delighted to listen to him today, and he's going to be talking about weak nature, coping with uncertainty through redundancy. Mak, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Edward. So here's the plan for today. My talk is divided into two parts. In the first part, I would like to introduce you to the phenomenon of redundancy. Although at first, the topic of redundancy might strike you as being overly specialized, one of the points that I would like to get across in the first part of this talk is actually that redundancy is a very common feature in the biological world, right? So redundancy is something that you see like across multiple levels of biological hierarchy, and also like across different types of biological groups. Another point that I would like to get across in the first part of this talk is that redundancy is not only a neat phenomenon in nature, but it is also something that if we get a better understanding of how it works, it's likely to have ramifications to other topics that people in philosophy of science and philosophy of biology are interested in, such as the problem of cooperation. Okay. So one of the key points then in the first part is that redundancy is ubiquitous. It's pervasive in the natural world. The question that this immediately opens up is, well, why is that the case? Why is it the case that redundancy is so common in nature? And that is going to take us to the second portion of the talk, and in which I will offer an explanation for redundancy in some biological systems. So that you have a feel for the kind of position that I'm going to be arguing for in the second part of this talk. Basically, what I'm going to be arguing here is that redundancy is an evolutionary strategy that biological systems can rely on to properly cope with environmental uncertainty. So the key idea there is that redundancy can reduce or offset the costs associated with environmental uncertainty. Okay, so that you have a general idea of the talk, so we're going to start very general, talking about redundancy in general, and then in the second part of the talk, which is going to be the bulk of this talk, we're going to be looking at a particular explanation for redundancy. Okay, so one of the first examples of redundancy that I came across was in the literature about redundancy in insect colonies. Some of these examples involve redundancy in ant colonies, and authors often call this type of redundancy as involving lazy ants. So the idea here is that the lazy ants are the redundant portion of the insect colony. So here's basically what happens. So there's a portion of the insect colony, where they're composed by the lazy ants, and they are just hanging out. They are inactive, right? So they just, they're not active in the colony. But here's the thing though. When they are needed, they spring into action. So they are not really lazy. They are lazy in a very contrived sense, in the sense that they are inactive, but then when they are needed, they can become active. There is a nice way of putting it by this paper by Charbonneau and others from the PLOS one that he provides an argument for the idea that lazy ants, they are like the reserve labor force of the colony, right? So I think that's a nice way of capturing what is going on here. Before I move on, let me just mention something very quickly here. Even though I only have like 3 ants there forming the lazy ants, actually redundancy in insect colonies is something that's much more substantial. So in some cases, it has been reported that over 50% of the colony is formed by lazy workers, right? So redundancy here is not just like a minor phenomenon, but it's something that is very substantial. So at first I thought, well, maybe this is just a feature of insect colonies. But I quickly realized, it doesn't take long to realize that actually that redundancy is actually a feature of multiple biological systems. As I mentioned, you have redundancy in insect colonies. But if you look at your own body, for instance, you have examples of redundancy as well. One simple example would be, for instance, your kidneys. People typically have 2 kidneys, and if one of them malfunction, you might still survive. So the extra kidney is supposed to be an example of redundancy. But you also have examples of redundancy in the human body involving, at the molecular level as well. So you have different types of redundancy inside your body. In addition to insect colonies in your human body, you also have like redundancy in social groups. One example of this would be collective hunting. Right? So you can have redundancy there in the sense that you can have extra hunters, and those extra hunters would be an example of redundancy involving social groups. So even at the genetic level, you can find redundancy. In the case of genes, two simple examples that illustrate how common redundancy is at the genetic level are cases of gene duplication. So you can have copies of the same gene that codes for the same function. Another interesting case of redundancy at the genetic level is what you find in the genetic code, right? So you can have different sequences of nucleotides, the codons, that code for the same amino acid. So the general picture that we get from this is that redundancy is something that is very common in the biological world. That was enough to grab my interest, because why on earth would something like this evolve across different levels of biological hierarchy and across different biological groups? But then I decided, well, what about outside of biology? Is there a lot of work about redundancy outside of biology? And the answer is yes. The same pattern that I mentioned earlier involving biological systems, you see in studies outside of biology. You have examples of redundancy involving technologies. Like on this slide, I have this is supposed to be a jet engine. So the idea here is that for some aircrafts, of course, that have multiple engines, you can have a case of redundancy in which if one of them fails, the aircraft can still fly relying on the other engines. Another interesting example of redundancy involving technology is the World Wide Web. In this case, the difference is the redundancy here has to do with network. Right? Another interesting example of redundancy involves like human organizations. In the case of human organizations, redundancy here takes the form of having multiple teams working towards solving the same problem. Like, I don't know, how to build a satisfactory public transit system, for instance, right? So you can have different teams that are working towards the same goal. And so those teams would be, the fact that you have multiple teams working on the same problem would be a case of redundancy. Okay, so let me step back a little bit then. So the general picture that we have here then is that we have a lot of cases of redundancy in the biological world. We have cases of redundancy outside of biology. But what is interesting about the literature is that they often don't engage with each other. So even within biology, the literature about redundancy involving genes does not engage much with people talking about redundancy about social insects. Of course, there are some exceptions there and there, but oftentimes they are not engaging with each other. So once I realized that, I got interested in trying to see how these different studies about redundancy fit together, or if they fit together at all. And this talk is part of this project. As you might suspect, one of the key challenges when trying to understand how this literature about redundancy fits together, it has to do with terminology. So here's a distinction that might help you understand what I mean by redundancy. So there are two ways that redundancy can be produced. One of them is what I call here on this slide, copy redundancy. So this is a simpler way of generating redundancy, that you just have copies of the same component, right? Like the multiple engines in an aircraft would be an example of copy redundancy. Another example of a copy redundancy would be gene duplication. You would have copies of the same gene that is capable of performing the same function. But there is a more sophisticated type of redundancy. And that is what I'm calling here functional redundancy, which basically involves a situation in which the redundant components, they can perform the same task, but they differ in other respects. One example might be, for instance, if you're trying to hit a nail, you can use a hammer, or you can use, I don't know, a rock or a water bottle. Maybe not a good idea. One biological example here would be when you look at the genetic code, right? So even though you have different sequences of nucleotides, so they differ from each other, so they are not copies, but they are capable of performing the same function. Just as a side note, in the literature about redundancy, especially the literature involving redundancy at the genetic level, they often use the term degeneracy. So degeneracy and functional redundancy are the same thing for me. So if you're familiar with that literature, degeneracy just means functional redundancy for this talk. Okay. So the general picture that we get here then is that there are two ways that you can produce redundancy. And what is relevant for having redundancy is just that the redundant components, they can perform the same task. They can be copies of each other, or they can differ from each other, but they still have to be able to perform the same task. Redundancy is a neat phenomenon, but as I mentioned earlier, a better understanding of redundancy I believe, is likely to impact other issues in philosophy of science and philosophy of biology. One of them is a better understanding of redundancy can probably help us better understand how biological systems tackle uncertainty. Since I'm going to talk about this in the second half of the talk, I will just leave it there for now, and I will go back to this in a little bit. Another interesting ramification of the discussion about redundancy is with the problem of cooperation. As you probably are familiar with, the problem of cooperation is essentially the problem of explaining how cooperation can be prevalent in a population when there is an incentive for individuals to cheat. But there's an interesting connection between cooperation and redundancy. And the connection is basically this. In some social groups, like the insect colonies, you have extra cooperators, right? So you have redundant cooperators. So in the case of the lazy ants, for instance, the lazy ants would be the extra cooperators. And that is very neat because that makes the problem of cooperation even more challenging in certain respects, because now the problem is not only the problem of explaining why we have cooperation, but the problem here becomes why we have extra cooperation, right? Which is, I think, is a particularly interesting issue. A little bit of self-promotion here. So if you're interested in this topic, there's a paper that is probably going to come out this year, but it's available online. It's going to come out at BJPS. Another interesting paper is a paper by Birch, which is actually the paper that brought to my attention that there was an interesting connection between cooperation and redundancy. There are other interesting ramifications of the discussion about redundancy. I'm just going to mention them very quickly, in case you're interested in those topics. One interesting ramification of the discussion about redundancy is the transitions in individuality, such as the evolution of multicellularity from unicellular ancestors. Another interesting ramification of the discussion about redundancy has to do with complex systems. As I mentioned earlier, there are multiple examples of redundancy, both in biology and outside of biology, which suggests that a better understanding of redundancy may help us understand how complex systems work. Okay, so let me drink some water. Okay, so here's what we have so far. So as I mentioned, redundancy is a very common feature in the biological world. And another point that I made is that there are interesting points of contact between redundancy and other topics that philosophers of science and philosophers of biology are interested in. So this slide is just a schematic representation of these potential ramifications. as I mentioned, like in the beginning of the talk, my focus in the second half of the talk, it has to do with the connection between redundancy and uncertainty. And that's what I would like to talk next in the next, I believe, like 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes. Excuse me. The connection between redundancy and environmental uncertainty seems to be intuitive, given what we talked earlier. Here's an example that might help foster this intuition. If you have a redundant ant colony, right, you would expect it to be more resilient to random perturbation than a non-redundant ant colony, right? For instance, like suppose that the random perturbation here, for instance, is a predator that shows up out of the blue and kills a few workers. You would expect that the ant colony that has a reserve labor force is going to be able to handle that unexpected event better than the non-redundant colony. So there seems to be an interesting connection here between redundancy and environmental uncertainty. And that's the intuition that I would like to unpack a little bit more in the next few slides. Uncertainty is key because of struggle for existence. In the struggle for existence, organisms are constantly grappling with high levels of uncertainty in the sense that they have limited information about their selective environment. So essentially, the evolutionary fate of a lineage depends on their ability to adopt successful strategies while at the same time having limited information about their environment. There are different reasons why the uncertainty in the environment might increase. One of them is, for instance, like a change in the abiotic portion of the environment. What I have on this slide, for instance, is the presence of artificial lights. So in the case of moths, you can have like a perfectly fine navigation system, but because of like an abrupt change in the environment, the navigation system was thrown off. But changes in the abiotic environment is not the only source of uncertainty that organisms face. A lot of times, uncertainty gets increased because of the living portion of the environment or the biotic portion of the environment. The example that I have here is the cases of mimicry, like the anglerfish mimicry. So the idea here is that if you, for instance, like a little crustacean living in the sea, minding your own business, because of the presence of the anglerfish, you're put in a situation in which what you might think to be like a nice and delicious meal turns out to be a trap, and you get eaten instead. So the presence of the anglerfish in the environment is going to increase the level of uncertainty that the crustacean faces. There is a nice expression from Kim Sterelny that I would like to borrow from his work, and that is like the notion of informationally opaque environments. I'm afraid that I'm using it in a more general sense than he uses in his 2003 book, but here's what I mean by an opaque environment. By an opaque environment, I just mean it's an environment in which the organism fail to track a feature in their environment that can hurt their fitness. For instance, going back to the previous example, if you're a little crustacean and if you live in an environment that you have a lot of anglerfish hanging out there, and assuming that you are very bad at distinguishing what is a lure and what is food, you're going to be living in a highly opaque environment. One quick note here. Even though I'm using examples of mimicry here, by opaque environment, I mean something that is much broader than this, right? So a situation in which a particular organism doesn't have sufficient information about where the location of the food source is, that would be a case of opaque environment as well, because that's a feature of the environment that, that the organism doesn't have information about, that in turn is going to hurt its fitness. Two other clarifications that I would like to add here. The first one is that being an opaque environment is a matter of degree, right? So environments can be less or more opaque, or like Kim Sterelny likes to say, the environment can be translucent, right? So as you increase, for instance, the frequency of anglerfish, you might make the environment of the little crustacean more or and less opaque. The second clarification that I would like to add here is that being an opaque environment is relative to a particular type of organism. So in this case of the anglerfish, the environment is highly opaque for the crustacean, but for the anglerfish, you know, that's not the case, or at least not necessarily the case. Okay. In one nice way of understanding what opaque environments involve is to think of it as consisting of a mismatch between the organism's detection capabilities and their environment. Right? So the basic idea then is that when you have an opaque environment, there's a mismatch between the detection system and environmental states, so that it can hurt the fitness of the organism in question. So there are two main strategies that organisms might adopt to deal with this mismatch. One strategy would be to acquire a more accurate detection system. And so basically what they're doing here, they're augmenting their detection system. And that might happen due to, I don't know, an improvement in visual acuity, for instance, or it can be via rely on multiple cues instead of only one for navigation, let's say. So essentially what the first strategy here is doing is extracting more information from the environment. And by extracting more information from the environment, this strategy is reducing the level of uncertainty that the organism, that the lineage faces in that particular environment. Redundancy, I would like to say, is an alternative strategy. It's a strategy that does not involve extracting more information from the environment. Instead, what redundancy is doing is reducing the costs of opaque environments. Like, for instance, if an uncertain event, unexpected event, I should say, happens, right? Like in the case of lazy ants that I was mentioning earlier. So a way of understanding the contrast here then is that in the first strategy, you reduce the level of uncertainty, so you prevent errors from happening. In the case of redundancy, you're containing the damage produced by errors. So if you're, just as a side note, if you're familiar with Nassim Taleb's Black Swan, there is an interesting parallel here between what I'm saying here and his positions about environmental, about uncertainty. Okay, so there are two main strategies. So let me say a little bit more about how redundancy can function as a evolutionary strategy for tackling opaque environments. The point here, as I say on this slide, is that redundancy enables systems to absorb errors from their components. This is an idea that goes all the way back to the work by von Neumann on automata. It's a very simple idea, but extremely powerful. Here's an example, and that's what you have on the box. It's a simple example to illustrate what I mean by the statement that redundancy can absorb errors from their components. Suppose you have a mechanical device that is very lousy. It only works 60% of the time, so there's a 40% chance of failure. So it's not a particularly good piece of machinery. But now suppose that you have multiple machines, like copies of this machine, that is working in parallel. What is interesting about this is that if you only need one of those machines to work properly, you dramatically increase the reliability of the system as a whole, right? Even though you're using very lousy machines that have a high chance of failure. So here's an example it's a very simple graph. It's just to make it vivid how much of a difference redundancy can make when you inject redundancy into a particular system. So even though these machines, as I said, they're very bad, they're not very reliable. When you have, I don't know, like 10 of these machines working in parallel, and you only need one of them to function properly, the reliability of the system jumps all the way, not exactly 100%, but it gets very close to 100%. Right? So at the system level, you have very high reliability. At the component level, very low reliability. Right? That's what I meant when I said that redundancy is a particularly powerful feature to add to a particular system. This is a nice way of encapsulating, I think, what is going on here. And this is from this paper by Landau. The idea here is that what is neat about redundancy is that you can have arithmetic increases in redundancy, but that is going to produce you geometric increases in reliability in the system. Okay, there is a little caveat here though, right? There is a key assumption that I'm making here when I'm providing you with this example. And here's the assumption. I am assuming that the chance of success and failure of these machines, they are independent. They are independent in the sense that if one of them fails, it's not going to cause the other ones to fail, right? So they work in parallel, and their chance of success or failure, they're independent from each other, right? So that has to be the case for this argument that redundancy can dramatically increase the reliability of the whole system. So which takes me to another point I would like to make, which is that redundancy can absorb local errors, like I was saying before, if the components are decoupled. By decoupled here, I mean, it simply is a shorter way of saying that the chance of failures of the redundant components is statistically independent to a certain degree. And as you probably can guess, when I say to a certain degree, because I don't want to only deal with situations in which you have total independence, but I'm allowing the level of decoupling here to vary by degree. So here's a simple example to illustrate what I have in mind here. Like going back to the example involving your kidneys, if it is the case that every time that one of your kidneys malfunction, the other one is going to malfunction as well, if that happens every single time, then redundancy is not going to be able to increase the reliability of your body, right? Similarly, if you have a situation in which every time that an engine in an aircraft causes the other engines in the aircraft to fail as well, then you don't have a case in which you can absorb the errors of the errors of its local components. The local components here are the jet engines. Okay, so here's the point that I'm making here. Oftentimes, redundancy is associated with the idea of having extra components. The point that I'm making on this slide is that that is not sufficient. You also have to have some level of decoupling between the components. Because for redundancy to allow system to absorb errors from these components, you have to have a situation in which a local failure is not going to spread to the other components. If you have a system that is highly coupled, which is the opposite of being decoupled, what you would have a situation in which a local failure is just going to percolate through the whole system, right? So that's what decoupling is preventing from happening. Okay, so that's the key idea. So redundancy can absorb errors, but to absorb errors, it requires decoupling. So up to this point, I've been talking about redundancy, but I didn't talk much about opaque environments. So let's now move to the next puzzle. The next piece of the puzzle, which is the connection between what I'm talking about here about absorbing errors and opaque environments. Oftentimes in nature, you have a situation in which there is a very valuable group benefit. I don't know, like protection from predators, let's say, right? And for a group to be able to obtain that group benefit, they have to perform a particular group task, right? They have to alert others, for instance, but the idea is they have to perform a particular group task in order to obtain that group benefit that is then shared by the members of the group. One interesting example of this is the hunting behavior of vampire bats. So in this case, the group task here is to obtain enough blood for the group to survive. And the group here is, it's a group of vampire bats. So opaque environments become relevant here because oftentimes group tasks are performed under opaque environments. And this is certainly the case in the example involving vampire bats, because we have a situation here in which they need blood to survive. But the issue here is, one, they cannot survive for more than 3 days without blood. And two, there's a very high chance that they're going to be unsuccessful in their hunt. So a lot of times a bat goes out and is not able to obtain blood. So this is just to make the point that, you know, like in this case, the group needs to perform a group task to obtain a group benefit, like food, like in this case, but they often face opaque environments. So how do they solve this problem? Basically, redundancy. So here's basically what happens. A very quick summary, but essentially, the way that they handle the fact that they deal with an opaque environment is by having the following design strategy. You have multiple bats that hunt in parallel, and some of them are going to be successful, some of them are not going to be successful. As I mentioned, the chance of failure is significant. But what happens is, if one bat acquires blood and the other one doesn't, if they're fellow members, the one that obtained blood shares the blood with the other one that was not successful in the hunt. You see here that you have a situation that is very similar to what I was talking earlier about absorbing errors, because the situation that we have here is that individual failure does not necessarily compromise the ability of the group to obtain enough blood, right? So you have the same design strategy that I discussed previously when I was talking about how redundancy can absorb errors from its components. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, redundancy is only capable of absorbing errors if you have decoupling. So the next thing I would like to talk to you is, why is it that decoupling is important in the case of cooperative hunting? Here's a very simple example to illustrate why decoupling is key for the group to obtain enough blood. So this is a toy example, of course, just to make things simpler. Suppose that you have like two bats, Maria and Pedro. Assume that they're redundant, they form a redundant group in the sense that you only need one of them to obtain blood for the group to obtain enough food to survive. So only one of them needs to be successful for them to survive as a group. Okay, so coupling here, suppose that you have a knob that you can play with the level of coupling or decoupling. saying that that this system is highly coupled means that if one of them is successful, the other one is more likely to be successful as well, right? So if you have a system that is highly decoupled, what this means is the fact that Maria or Pedro was successful does not affect the probability that Pedro is going to fail or be successful. Okay, so let's see how it works in this case. So suppose that Maria was successful. In this case, if you increase coupling, you're going to increase the chance that Pedro is going to also be successful, right? But that is not necessary, because by hypothesis, you only need one of them to be successful for the group to survive. So the fact that coupling is going to increase the chance of joint successes is not going to matter in this case when it comes to guaranteeing the persistence of the group. But now suppose that Maria is not successful, right? Maria had she got unlucky, she didn't obtain blood. In a situation like this, Pedro must be successful. And here's the thing. What this tells us is that given that the chance of failure is significant, what you want to have in order to guarantee the group survival is that you have a situation in which one of them can fail, but the other one can succeed, right? But here's the thing. Coupling is going to increase the chance of successes, but also is going to increase the chance of failures or joint failures. So coupling is going to cause not only increase the chance that the other one is going to be successful, but it's going to also increase the chance that if Maria fails, Pedro is also going to fail, right? And that's a no-no, because then they're not going to have enough blood to survive. This is to say then that they're, as a group, they're going to do better if they're highly decoupled, because in this case, if Maria fails, that is not going to increase the chance that Pedro is going to fail as well, right? So as I put it here, redundancy, because of decoupling, essentially enables systems to engage in multiple independent bets. So it is as if the different redundant components, they are probing their environment in independent ways, right? And of course, the level of independence here is going to depend on the level of decoupling. One thing I would like to add here is that the argument that I'm presenting here is very general. You could substitute Maria and Pedro by any other organism that is engaged in a group task. So I just would like to point out that this is not an argument that's supposed to only apply to bats, but it's intended to be an argument that are going to apply to other group tasks that are performed under opaque environments. Okay. One thing that I would like to go back to is the distinction that I mentioned earlier between copy and functional redundancy, right? So the distinction basically, as a refresher, so the copy redundancy is when you have copies of each other, and functional redundancy is what some people call degeneracy, which is a situation in which the components differ, but they can perform the same task. In the case of copy redundancy, you can enable the system to engage in independent bets, right? So they can fail independently because of like stochastic changes in the environment, right? So you can have, let's say, two clones, like two bats that are clones of each other, and one of them might succeed and the other one might fail because of random changes in the environment. So even when you have copy redundancy, you can still engage in independent bets in the sense that I was mentioning earlier. But with functional redundancy, which is a more sophisticated version of redundancy because you have some diversity among the redundant groups, things change a little bit in that now we can, when you inject diversity into the system, you can probe the environment in very different ways. Here's an example illustrating what I have in mind here. Sexual reproduction is supposed to to generate diversity in the population. But for sexual reproduction to do this, what is relevant is not only that you have a oversupply of gametes, right? Another thing that is relevant is that the gametes they differ from each other genetically. Another interesting example in which this distinction between copy redundancy and functional redundancy might be relevant is when we think about redundancy in human organizations like institutions. Because for redundancy to be effective in human organizations, what you want to have is not just have like multiple teams working parallel, but they use the same approach. What you want to have is a situation in which the teams work independently from each other, but also they differ in how they approach that problem. So in the case of human organizations, you can see here that diversity is going to increase the ability of the system to cope with novel changes, right? Okay, so that's, I think, did I speak too fast or? Okay, so let me just, so let me just close the main things that I talked to you today. So here are the main take-home messages. One of the things that I conveyed in the first half of the talk is that redundancy is a very common phenomenon in nature, but also in non-biological systems. Another point that I tried to get across in the first half of this talk is that redundancy is a phenomenon that has that impacts like different issues in philosophy of biology, such as the problem of cooperation. It also helps us understand how biological systems cope with environmental uncertainty. Some of the key ideas that I discussed in connection with the third bullet point here is that for redundancy to help systems to tackle uncertainty, redundancy has to enable the system to absorb errors from these components. And for systems to be able to absorb errors, decoupling is a key component, right? And as mentioned in the previous slide, there seems to be an interesting connection between diversity and redundancy as well, in the sense that as you inject more diversity into the redundant components, you enable systems to better cope with novel disturbances, okay? And yeah, so I think that's it. Hopefully I didn't speak too fast. And yeah, thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Mike, for this wonderful talk. Let me remind you how we're going to be proceeding. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just write your name. I will then promote you to the status of panelist, and you can ask your question directly to Mak. It takes a few seconds for me to do that, so be patient. And we're going to have the first question by Sandy. Sandy, the floor is yours.
Hi, that was a great talk. As you know, I'm really interested in this topic, and I guess I have one question about treating functional redundancy and copying redundancy as just treating them as both cases of redundancy, because there was a long debate in biology about how to explain, for example, genetic robustness. For a long time, it thought that you just had all these extra copies, like you showed in your first slide, standing in weight. And then it turns out that did not, from experimental work on knockout experiments and other things, it looked like that wasn't actually what was going on at all. But in fact, there was a reorganization of a genetic regulatory network that was maintaining function, right, when you deleted all of these, genes. So it wasn't like there were more genes in reserve in this kind of copy redundancy model. So I'm curious, and in fact, that whole waft of biological research led in I think, important ways to the development of systems biology. So there's this kind of ontological shift of focus from the individuals. I need this part to do this job. So if this part gets broken, I need another one just like it, you know, to looking at the way in which network organization actually accomplishes these kinds of functional robustness in the face of changing environments and interference from outside and inside and stuff. So I'm wondering how you manage that ontological shift by collapsing both of them, and how do you account for the debate that seemed to have been won, at least for some forms of genetic redundancy, won by the network models and giving up on the kind of copy model?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. Yeah, no, thank you. You can hear me, right? Yeah. Okay, awesome. Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. So yeah, no, I totally see your point. That when you're looking at the genetic level, maybe collapsing these two types of redundancy is not going to do you much work, because the kind of situation that you're dealing with here is a much more interesting type of redundancy that's not just, like you said, like a bunch of copies, right? But you have very rich ways that the genetic system can react to stimuli, right? So it's not just have a bunch of copies and this one, you know, it's not working and the other ones can take the work, but it's a much more sophisticated way. So yeah, I agree with you that maybe bringing them together might not be helpful in this context. So I'm basically agreeing with you. Another example that this distinction does not seem to, bringing them under redundancy is not very helpful, is when also we talk about human organizations, right? Which was the example that I mentioned later, which is another case in which collapsing these two types of redundancy is not going to do you much work, because, you know, if you have a human organization but everyone is using the same approach, that's not going to take you much further, right? So what you need to have is something that is not just copy redundancy, right? So this is just a long way to say that I'm very sensitive to what you're saying, namely that the definition of redundancy that is going to be relevant is probably going to depend on the system that you're working with. And if you're working with a genetic system, you probably want to keep them separate. Yeah. And thank you for the suggestion. Yeah.
Can I just add that it's true in the social insects too? Even the lazy ants led to a kind of dynamic algorithm. It wasn't about having copies of ants around. It was about network organization there too. So I mean, there is a debate, and maybe it's a futile debate, because there are those who work on copy redundancy and they think it's important, those who work on robustness of networks and they think that's important, and they're both probably important. It's just that because it was framed, and maybe you have a way to educate the debate, it was framed as, well, is it this or that? It turns out in a lot of cases where they thought it was copy redundancy, you ended up to have functional network robustness. So anyway, I just wanted to suggest it wasn't just genes. I mean, all of the areas, brain network, you know, brain structure, all of these are supposed to have the same debate, right? Structure. Anyway, thank you very much.
So thank you. Yeah. So the only thing that I would like to add, as you said, like the social insects, you also have like things get much more complicated. Also because you can have this, you can have a type of redundancy in which the same insect can perform different functions, right? So which is a different type of redundancy than the one that was mentioned here. I guess if there is a benefit to bringing them under the same umbrella of redundancy is maybe that you can see some features that they share with each other. Maybe there are different ways that they all absorb errors in a sense. Maybe they just have different ways to do that. So if there is I'm not to say that I'm not sensitive to the points that you were mentioning, but my sense is that calling them redundancy might help us see some patterns that they share with each other.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your suggestion. Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. Samantha, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Oh, you can't see me at all. Hi, thanks.
Hi.
I'm joining from the Department of Biology, so I'm just an ecology evolution person who's very interested in sort of the philosophy of science. And something that I was wondering about during your talk was, I've always thought of redundancy as like an emergent property of
Mhm.
a system and not necessarily as like something driven by evolution per se. Like, for example, the lazy ants, I tend to think of them as cheaters.
Mhm.
And that they're evolved not because they add redundancy to the colony, but because they gain an
Mhm.
individual fitness benefit from being
Right.
lazy. And then you get this emergent property of like, okay, but if catastrophe hits, then
Mhm.
you have
Mhm.
these reserve
Right.
gains. And same for, and so I was just wondering, yeah, how you sort of, and the same can be said for even when cheating's not involved, for example, like larger clutch sizes, like that's an individual fitness goal, but you
Mhm.
also get more individuals. And I'm wondering how you sort of reconcile the emergent property versus like when we think evolution is actually driving redundancy.
Right, right. No, awesome. Yeah, no. So there is and I think you correct me if I'm wrong, Samantha, right? Yeah. One interesting issue involving redundancy that I didn't discuss at all is that, I mean, from the point of view of the system is great, right? That you have redundancy, but from the point of view of the individuals, that's a very bad business because basically you increase the reliability of the system at the expense of the individual parts, right? So there is an interesting issue about, well, how do you explain the evolution of redundancy, right? Because it's not good for the components to allow redundancy to evolve. So this is not something that I discussed in the talk, but very quickly, one of the papers that I mentioned earlier by Birch, the strategy that he tries to use is to rely on policing to explain how redundancy might emerge. So that's one venue that you might go with this. The one that I've been particularly interested lately, and that was in one of the papers that I mentioned in the talk, is the possibility that maybe redundancy might evolve as a byproduct of something else. And then, so initially it didn't evolve because there was a selection for that trait. But then once it evolved, then you got favored. But yeah, so what is interesting about this then is a lot of the things that I talked about in the talk has to do with why redundancy is good for the group. But I'm pushing to the background this question that is particularly difficult, I think, which is to explain how it initially evolved. Does that connect with what you?
Yeah, it does. I mean,
Okay.
basically, I think I'm coming from the side where I think in terms of the mechanisms that result in redundancy may not be like they might not be purposefully like causing redundancy. It's like this, it just happened and then all of a sudden it is good. Yeah. Okay,
Right.
cool. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, that's what I think as well.
Yeah.
That's my impression.
Thank you very much, Meta. Mike, the floor is yours.
Hey, Mac.
Hi.
I continue to be very interested in this project. And in particular, I'm still getting caught up and dwelling on the relationship between coupling and decoupling with respect to the whole independence of bets line of explanation. This time, seeing this talk, I lasered in on the fact that, rightfully so, that your definition of coupling or decoupling is entirely statistical, which struck me today as it places it as a feature of the environment in a slightly troubling sort of way. And so I was curious whether you've thought at all about that. So to give a slightly more concrete, hypothetical, I'm thinking about in a finite resource environment or finite resource game, in some respects, what's happening if we both go for too high of a bargain is revealing that it's a feature of the environment, namely the finite resource aspect of the situation, that is causing there to be more coupling than if it was an infinite resource, in which case any amount that lets me prosper would be great.
Okay. That's neat. Okay. Is that? Yeah. No. So this is an interesting suggestion because the way that and I guess that's what you're getting at is that the way that I was talking about decoupling was supposed to be an internal feature of the system, right? But you seem to be suggesting is that depending on the changes in the environment, you might increase or decrease decoupling. Is that right? Yeah. No, that's an interesting idea. I haven't. This is So yeah, no, I think that's probably relevant because so you would. I guess that was the case that you were talking about. If the chance of failure is very low, right? You would imagine that decoupling would go down. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think more about that. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything smart to say, but I do like your suggestion a lot. I think I think there's something neat there. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. No, thank you for mentioning it. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Katie, floor is yours.
Hi, Mac.
Hi.
Thanks for this. I'm not all that familiar with the concept of redundancy or some of the examples that you were drawing on. But I'm wondering, so this is probably just going to be clarification for me. So I'm wondering what you would think of the following argument, and if someone has made it already, like, why do you think that's not a good way to go to think about this? Okay. So I'm thinking just on the examples that you gave, why not think of redundancy as being something rather like a form of functional specialization, in the sense of the lazy ants are not like redundant ants. They're just functionally specified to be like an emergency reserve labor force. And that's, like that's just how they fit into the system as a whole. Now, of course, that doesn't address situations like the human kidney, where it does seem like we just have a copy of this one thing. And to explain why we have two of them, the fail-safe argument that you were making makes a lot of sense. Now, I don't know that I would necessarily call that some kind of like error reduction strategy.
Right.
Because there's all sorts of ways in which like a kidney could shut down or something could go wrong that have nothing to do with errors in the functioning of the kidney or the functioning of the organism, but have rather to do with like coming into contact with toxic features of your environment or something like that. Yeah, but I'm just wondering, like, do you think there's any merit to thinking about this as just a form of functional specification? I guess this is sort of tagging along Sam's question too.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think, I mean, one of the things that I was trying to get across and with the distinction between copy redundancy and functional redundancy is maybe to distinguish this a case that you have like functional specialization to the case you only have copies of each other. One thought about this, and you tell me if it is along the lines of what you're thinking, is that there might be some interesting connections between simple copy redundancy with like some type of functional specialization. Like for instance, in the case of gene duplication, right? You can have copies of the same gene, and then one gene diverge from the other one, and then you have some functional. You can have like some functional. You can have some division of labor, right, between them. So this is a long way to say that when you're dealing with copy redundancy, I'm less inclined to see them as a kind of division of labor, like in the kidney case that you were mentioning. But there is an interesting connection with, I think, what you were suggesting, which is you can initially have copy redundancy, and then that can evolve some division of labor later. I'm not sure if that entirely addresses your concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Maybe the part that's kind of like giving me a little bit of philosophic irritation is just the idea that like the concept of redundancy seems to build in an idea of there being a purposefulness to it.
Right. Yeah, I see why you say. So that goes back to the question with Sam. Yeah. So so basically my thought about this is similar to what I said in response to her comment, which is my impression is that there's a question about why redundancy is beneficial for the group, and there's a very different question, which is how did redundancy evolve initially, right? And if you press me on this, I will probably suggest that a lot of times probably redundancy evolved as a byproduct of something else, right? So initially it didn't have a purpose, right? But once it evolved, it became beneficial for the group.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question.
All right, so we have time for more questions. If there are some, please write your name in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I had a question, so maybe while people are thinking about it's really sort of something we talked about in recent weeks. And it's related to the distinction you make at the end between copy redundancy and functional redundancy. And I was thinking about the type of risks that might give rise to one or the other form of redundancy. So you might think that for airplanes, like modern airplanes have, like commercial airplanes, they have two different engines. And why? Well, because one thinks that the source of failures are they're the same, right? I mean, there would be no real benefit of having two different engines. You know, what you know, an engine is going to break. Well, there can be a specific type of outside injury, like a bird getting into it, or something intrinsic, like I don't know very much about engine, but it's a bit unclear why you would want to have diversity here in the design of the redundant part. By contrast, you might think that, you know, instead of the example of the perceptual systems, then of course you definitively want to have a form of redundancy that allows the system to exploit different channels of information, right? So visual information, lights, the sound waves, and that kind of things, because you get access to different information that allows you to triangulate. So there, in some ways, you would predict diversity. Now, I don't know about the lungs, I don't know about other parts of the body, but I think there's something to be said here interesting about types of failure risks and the type of redundancy you should be expecting. I don't have any systematic view about how that's going to be working, but I think there's definitively something there to be said. So I wanted to know whether you had any thought on the matter.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting suggestion. Yeah, because basically what I've been doing here is just saying, calling them all opaque environments and just including all types of risks within the same term, right? And what you're suggesting is like, there's a lot of differences there, and depending on these differences, that different types of redundancy might be good, might be better at certain types of research than others.
That's exactly right. You know, I mean, it's quite striking that, I mean, you know, there's of course developmental constraints, right, to take into account. But for the body plan, it's really, I mean, as far as I know, I'm just not an expert in physiology, but except for the brain, which I think there are hemispheric differences in the brain, but it's for the lungs and I guess other organs. There's the two redundant organs are quite similar to one another. I believe, I might be wrong, and I'd be happy to be corrected. And then the question is why? Why hasn't some diversity been, at least some tweaking within the constraints of development having been built in? You know, I'm curious to know whether, well, is that an adaptation is it just a feature of the constraints? I don't know. It was just a really fascinating question about redundancy and its kinds and why we get that type of redundancy.
Yeah, no, awesome. Yeah, actually, you can see that like towards the end of the talk, when I was talking about diversity, there was a lot of I kind of sneaked in like novel disturbances, right? Which is, I think, is a way of you know, getting to your point, right? Because in the case of sexual reproduction, you don't want to have just a bunch of gametes that are genetically identical, right? You want to have some diversity. So in that case, so if you're concerned about novel disturbances, you know, you probably want to have something that is along the lines of functional redundancy.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. Yeah, that's awesome.
Am I back up again?
Okay.
Okay. All right. Because we could talk about this for a long time. So I think, again, one of the issues about you're talking about copy redundancy and robust functional redundancy is what is it when, and even Edward just said, so why do we have it? And I think part of it, in what I'm hearing in part by your accounts, is that there is one way of answering those why questions that was dominant for a long time, which was optimization theory in terms of fitness in evolution. And that is to treat each part as though it's independently evolvable, and you need to optimize fitness for the organism by treating each of these parts as removable and movable, and so add more or reduce, and then again the move both in systems biology and the push that robustness, which really is central to your account, was about development and not evolution. And so developmental arguments about why you have extra copies or diversity or certain network interactions, right? It gives you a very different way of, and maybe this is part what Samantha was referencing, that when you're saying, well, why do we have it? And you were looking for optimization arguments, basically. What does it let the system do? When in fact, there's these other source of answers which draw you more to developmental issues of how do you build it? And what do you get for free, if you like? I mean, that's stuff I worked on ages ago about, this when you have something, then maybe you can optimize it, but you don't have it because you needed it to optimize it. So I think, again, that bringing in both sides of the story, the evolutionary and developmental accounts, and the would enhance what you're doing, but then the strategies are not optimization arguments.
Right.
Or if they are, the goal of optimization is very different, stable organization rather than fitness, relative fitness improvement. So I think that's another angle to which to engage with the material that you're looking at, that I think would, reinforce what you're saying, but locate it, would fend off these objections in a kind of systematic way.
Awesome.
That's
awesome.
a suggestion, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I just have like a comment related to what you were saying about your suggestion of the connection between development and redundancy. But another thing that crossed my mind that I think that is interesting here is that I didn't talk much about the costs associated with redundancy. I've been just talking about all the good stuff that you get out of redundancy. But one thing that I'm not being explicit about is that redundancy is expensive, right? And I think there's an interesting connection there between the costs of redundancy and your point about optimization, right? Because you would think that there's an interesting body of work that I think is kind of neat that talks about the trade-off between being optimized for a particular time versus the ability to persist over a long time period, right? So it seems that there is a trade-off between these two things, which serves to show that you shouldn't be only concerned about optimization at a particular time, right? That redundancy is supposed to be something that is gonna, the benefits is gonna show up in the longer time scale, right? Which might, yeah, right.
Yeah, well, let's talk about this to let other people in, but
Sure.
because there's also organizational trade-offs between fragility and robustness too, not just in terms of evolutionary trajectory. So let's talk about this in another venue, on another Zoom opportunity.
Sure, that would be awesome. I
Thank
would
you.
love that. Oh, thank you so much for your suggestions. Yeah, that's very helpful.
Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mac. That was very interesting. I wanted to sort of come back to some sort of lurking implicit messaging in redundancy. So, but first, to follow up on sort of Sandy's comment about development, the question of why we might have two lungs or two kidneys could simply be that we're bilaterally symmetric, right? And so there need not be an adaptationist or selectionist explanation beyond bilateral symmetry is really great, right? And that could be the extent of that. But the question about redundancy itself, right? Even the idea to think that, oh, one of those kidneys is extra. There may be multiple copies of things that we have and none of them are extra, right? In other words, they're all absolutely necessary to have a fully functioning, for instance, renal system, or to have a fully functioning blood buffer system, or to have a fully functioning metabolism, right? So having multiple copies doesn't make them redundant in that sense, right? And so when do we have simply multiple units necessary for singular function and then when do we have multiple units that are in a sense not necessary for that singular function, but actually functionally redundant? And then how can you tell the difference between the two? So let me give you my favorite example. Right, we've had two full duplications of our entire genome. That means that our ancestors had 4 copies of every Hox gene we have. And that keeps us from doing things like growing limbs where they shouldn't be, which is something fruit flies can really do, which is very cool, right? So that's not possible in us because of that 4-fold duplication of our Hox limb regulators. You know, is that 4-fold redundancy a necessary redundancy or an unnecessary redundancy? Right? Is that even correctly to think about that repression as a function, or is that just an accident?
Okay, awesome. No, that's a good question. Here's a, one thought about like regarding your point about like when you really have a case of redundancy, or it's just a case that we need all those extra components, right? The way that I try to frame the discussion, and that's why the notion of group tasks kind of become relevant, because I was hoping, and feel free to follow up on this, is that by focusing on the particular group task that a system is supposed to perform, then you would have a better criterion to distinguish whether you have a real case of redundancy or if it is just like multiple parts that are necessary to perform that particular task, right? Yeah, so so when I say extra parts, often what I have in mind is extra parts relative to a particular group task, right? So in the case of like the lazy ants, for instance, it's not really required to have those lazy ants. In fact, the paper that I cited, they removed the active ants. The inactive ants become active, but the inactive ants are not, more inactive ants are not produced, right? So new lazy ants don't come in, right? So in that particular case, I think the distinction is clearer, right? Yeah, no, so that's my thought about how to distinguish it. I don't know if you have any follow-up suggestions.
I think it's easier in those cases because you're talking about things that we recognize as individuals. But if you're looking at things like copy redundancy in your genes, it's not automatically as clear that there's a group task unless you think of something like amylase metabolism is a group task, and therefore we need 4 copies of amylase.
Okay. So yeah, so let me just add something, what I think is to be the case, and I guess this connects with the question by Sandra. So the explanation that I'm providing here for redundancy is not expected to apply to every case of redundancy in nature, right? My goal here was just to look at a particular example of redundancy that I thought it was more tractable and try to provide an explanation that would fit it, right? My suspicion is that as you move to different systems like genetic systems, a different explanation is going to have to be used. Yeah, so which is a way of agreeing with you that when you're looking at the genetic system, probably you're going to have to tell a different story.
All right, thank you, Mike. David, the floor is yours. Turn your camera on. Yes, we hear you, but we can't see you. And here you go.
Thank you, Mark, for. Hi, Edward. Thank you, Mark, for the talk. Can you listen to me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm just wondering about this idea of evolutionary strategy, and you said that redundancy is a kind of strategy, but at the end of your talk, you said that diversity is kind of byproduct of the redundancy. But then answering Samantha, you said that that you thought of redundancy as a kind of emergency result. But then I was wondering if maybe redundancy is not or is a byproduct of redundancy instead of diversity being a product of redundancy. You know what I mean? I mean, you were trying to say that diversity is a kind of byproduct of the byproduct, which is redundancy. So what I'm thinking is that maybe redundancy is in itself a byproduct of diversity as an evolutionary strategy, because I'm saying that because on chapter 4 of the origin of species, Darwin said that that divergency on natural selection is a kind of byproduct of the natural selection. So in the way you stated the question, you said that diversity is a kind of multiple bets that redundancy brings to us. But maybe I was wondering if it's not the other way around. You know what I mean?
Okay, so let me see if David, yeah. So let me say what I think you might be suggesting, and you correct me. So one of the points that I was trying to get across there is that, and that was in response to the question by, I think, Samantha, right? Was that the issue there was, okay, sure, redundancy is beneficial for the group, but how did it initially evolve? And my guess was that it might have initially evolved as a byproduct of selection between individuals, right? So that was supposed to be the case for copy redundancy, and copy redundancy could have evolved as a byproduct. So your question is that the redundancy might have evolved as a byproduct of
diversity itself.
Diversity itself. So the situation that you have here, you have a very diverse group, and because you have this diversity, redundancy would evolve.
Because
okay.
I'm saying that because because in the chapter 4 in the origin of the species, right. Darwin said about the survival of the fittest. Right. Darwin said about natural selection that divergence of character is a part of the process of natural selection.
Right. Oh, yeah. No. So yeah. So I would say that's perfectly fine. So one type of possibility that I mentioned earlier, it might be causing some confusion, is that one possibility is that you can have copy redundancy, and copy redundancy can generate diversity because the copies might diverge from each other. But there is also the possibility that you can start with a system that is not redundant, that you have diverse strategies, and then maybe as a byproduct, maybe you have copies of one of those divergent individuals, right? Which is perfectly fine as well. That would be another way of generating redundancy. Yeah. So basically, I'm agreeing with you, if I understood you correctly. That might be very well a possibility, right? So just as a clarification, so the point that the discussion that I had here in this talk, it does not supposed to be an answer to the question of how redundancy originally evolved, even though that's a very neat question. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, but since we were talking about, I mean, that the idea of genetic robustness and ontological shift. In this debate about evolutionary strategy and how the redundancy play a role in that topic. I mean, I was just wondering. But yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
All right, thank you very much, and good to see you. If anyone has another question, we have a few more minutes left. Yes. All right. Barry has a question. All right. Barry? All right, let me try again. That didn't work. All right. Barry, the floor is yours. Go ahead. But don't forget to turn your, let me unmute you. Perry.
Okay.
Yes, it's working. You're mute, Perry. You're mute. We cannot hear you. Good.
Okay. My question is, in any given situation, it seems to be indeterminate whether redundancy would do any benefit or not.
Right.
I mean, like, you know, like out there shooting elephants, or one of these mass extinctions, or breakages in an ecological chain. Have you thought about any of this?
Yeah. So that's something that I've been. I mean, something that I keep in mind, because the thing is, and I guess that's what you might be suggesting, is that as was talking to Sandra earlier, there is a cost associated with redundancy, right? It's not like, it doesn't come for free. And maybe you might not be able to obtain the benefits of having a redundant system if the environment, for instance, remain the same, right? That's why I was suggesting that maybe the benefits of being redundant is not something that you're going to be able to see at a particular moment, but it's something that you're only going to be able to observe over a longer time scale. Because the idea is, you know, you have redundancy here, the environment remains the same, but then maybe if there is an abrupt change in the environment, then redundancy can come handy, right?
All right. Thanks, Perry. I think we will leave it at that for today. It's been actually a great Q&A, and it was plenty of... no, actually, hold on. There's one last question, and we have 4 minutes. So, Greg, let me just move you to the status of panelists. Let me just do that again. All right, Greg, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yes, very briefly, I wanted to go back to the human systems and wanted to make a few observations about both functional and copy redundancy in various human systems. One is in terms of both copy and functional redundancy. The current effort to put in a COVID-19 vaccine is very much along that line. They are taking several different approaches of very different natures, and each approach is getting several different studies in that. The other is with all of its other faults, military systems tend to be actually redundant, certainly copy redundant, because in any given situation, a headquarters unit or something like that could be wiped out. So with all of their other faults, human military systems are good at redundant systems. One that is not is the human financial system, where everyone seems to take the best system that's out there and everyone copies, duplicates that, and there's no real robustness or redundancy in the human way that we organize financial matters, which creates these crashes from time to time, as we all know. I guess then I'll talk about something I even know less about, which is the biology, but I think you were getting into this with Sandy and some of the other people, that some of the things that an individual might have as functionally problematic in any given situation are actually advantageous to the group as a whole. And I'm thinking, for example, in prokaryotic bacteria, those bacteria that cruise around with the resistance genes to antibiotics, when the antibiotics are not present, that is actually a cost to them individually, but the group as a whole over a protracted period benefits from that. I think this is what you were getting at. I'm also gathering that that has something to do with, for example, the human conditions like sickle cell anemia, resistance to malaria. And also, as I understand it, some forms of color blindness are actually beneficial in a group hunting setting. So is that sort of what you were getting at in terms of the costs associated with redundancy on an individual basis, but they benefit the group as a whole?
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah. So you gave like a nice set of examples that like from across different domains, and that's exactly the pattern that I'm trying to get across with this. Yeah. And the idea is here is that just as a side note, the idea here that motivates me in this project is that maybe you can get intuitions from different domains and apply them to the other ones, right? You mentioned like financial markets. I don't know if you're familiar with the work by Nassim Taleb. He's someone that is very skeptical about trying to develop better models for predicting financial markets or financial crisis. Instead, he's someone that thinks that we should create redundancies to prevent the damages from financial crisis, right? So yeah, so I totally agree with you. It seems to be like the same pattern across different systems. Yeah. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Greg. All right, and now we are going to end this wonderful meeting at 1:30 as usual. Thank you very much, Mak, for this amazing lecture and for this equally good Q&A. And we hope to see you on Friday at the next lunchtime talk given by Diane Leary, another center fellow. And thanks again, Mak.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the questions. That was fun.
Bye.
Bye.